Hello fellow Clashers, this is Kairos Time and welcome to another strategy guide to Clash Royale. Today we're going to be talking about how to build the best decks in the game. This guide is heavily influenced by strategy guides written by Edahow and MWolverine63 on Reddit. Make sure you guys check out their original posts in the description below. In today's video, we're going to talk about the different metas in the game and talk about everything you need to know about each one of them. We're going to talk about how you can dissect the meta, build the best deck according to that meta, and then we're going to talk about refining and testing your deck. This strategy guide is going to pull from a lot of information that I go over in previous strategy guides, so if you're confused about any of the topics that I talk about in today's video, I highly recommend going back and looking at previous strategy guides so you can get a better grasp of what I'm talking about. The first meta that we're going to talk about is the NonMax Ladder meta. The NonMax Ladder is actually very different depending on where you're at in trophies. In fact, sometimes a meta at one trophy count can be completely different than a meta only 100 trophies above. I get a lot of people that will ask me for some type of a deck to use in the ladder. The real thing is that different decks are going to do well or poorly depending on the meta that you're at. So unless you're in the exact trophy range that I'm at, it's difficult for me to actually prescribe a deck for you. It's much better for you to take a look at the meta that you're at and follow the principles that we talked about in the rest of the video so that you can build the best deck for your trophy range. That being said, because it is easier for you to level up commons and rares than epics and legendaries, there are certain cards that you can count on seeing in the non-max ladder no matter where you're at in the trophy range. The next meta is classic challenges or small tournaments. By far, this type of meta is the most relaxed and most fun meta out there. It's extremely diverse, and one card that might be popular in other metas might not be popular here, and other cards that are never used might also be used in classic challenges. This is where a lot of people will come and test out their decks, and that does create a very diverse and fun meta. There's still some competitiveness in classic challenges, but not as much as in grand challenges. Because of the cost, people don't normally go into a grand challenge unless they have a deck that they feel extremely confident with and that works very well. As such, the meta is always evolving and people are finding some of the best decks frequently to counter the previous meta. That means that one day you can do really well with the deck and then the very next day you might not. If you're serious about making a competitive deck and you do have the gems to spend, grand challenges are by far the best place to go and practice and test out your deck. By far the most competitive meta, and yet the meta that very few people actually get to be a part of, is the max ladder, specifically the top 200 players. Even though most people are not a part of this meta does have a huge influence on all of the other metas. Because it's really easy for you to take a look at the top 200 and take a look at the decks that they have, a lot of people will actually look at the max ladder and try and find a deck that might have a lot of commons or rares and then copy that, and so that they can use that wherever they're at in their ladder. This doesn't always work because at max ladder the cards are capped, whereas wherever you're at in the ladder they're not, but people still do it. So the next thing people think is that, well, the cards are capped in the max ladder, and so I'm going to go ahead and copy that deck for a grand challenge or a classic challenge. What's important to realize is that the meta in max ladder is actually very different than in grand challenges or even classic challenges. First, because of the additional 2 minutes of overtime, and second, because of the mindset of max ladder players. A max ladder player makes a deck so that they can climb trophies, whereas a tournament player will make a deck so that they can win. Because of this, the two different deck types are fundamentally different, but people still do copy them, and so it's very important for you to at least be aware of the meta that is happening in the max ladder. When most people want to make a deck, what they do is they take their experience, they throw some cards together, and they go out, play in the meta, try things out, and make changes until they finally have something that works. This is a very fast and easy way to make a deck, but if you're serious about making a really good deck, it's going to take a little bit more time and effort. So what you need to do is you need to dissect the meta. Pull it apart, figure out exactly what you're up against so that you can build a deck around that. What I recommend doing is pulling out a piece of paper and writing down 4 different categories here: win conditions, support troops, defenses, and spells. What I recommend doing is then writing down some of the most common cards in each of these different categories. Start off with the win conditions in your current meta, then move on to support troops, defenses, and spells. The cards that I put right here may or may not be examples of the current meta that we're in right now, but they do give a good example of what I mean by these 4 different categories. In my deck building fundamentals guide, I talk about the 9 different deck types that are in the game. They're sorted according to archetype, namely siege, beatdown, and control, and speed, which can be broken down into slow, medium, or fast. The next thing I recommend doing is thinking through the meta that you're playing in and maybe circle a few of the common deck types that are being used in the meta so that you can keep that in mind and counter them in the future. Here's a 2-triangle cheat sheet for you to use while you're building your deck. If you haven't watched my strategy guide on countering all deck types using the 2-triangle theory, I highly recommend going back and watching it. If you're serious about really dissecting dissecting the meta, the next place you'll want to go to is your battle log. Your battle log is extremely helpful because it's very accurate based off of the meta, because it's very up to date, as long as the past 25 replays are in the meta that you're trying to build a deck for. The one issue with this is that it does include a relatively small sample, but it's very important for you to use. As I said earlier, a lot of people will take a look at the max ladder decks, and so it's important for you, no matter where you're going to be playing in the meta, that you take a look at them as well. This does influence all of the metas, as I said earlier, but it's very important for you to realize that it's not necessarily super accurate, because decks that will work in max ladder might not necessarily work in other metas. The next place I highly recommend going to is deckshop.pro. If you go to the best decks section on the website, then it'll actually show you a lot of different decks that are currently really good and popular in the different metas. You can take a look at 12-win decks that are good for tournaments, as well as a lot of different decks that are currently being used in the different arenas. I also highly recommend going to statsroyale.com. This can be extremely useful because they can take a look at a lot of the most commonly used cards and sort them according to the cards that are being most used in the ladder, in different arenas, and also in challenges. The website also has a really fantastic section that shows you the most popular decks in the game, also sorted by challenges and different arenas. Now it's time to select a deck type for yourself. The questions you're going to want to ask is, which archetype am I going to play, beatdown, siege, or control? What speed am I going to play, fast, medium, or slow? And also whether or not you're going to be playing a unity deck or a balanced deck. If you're the kind of person that plays only 1 to 2 different types of decks, this is going to be an easy decision for you. If you're a generalist like me and like to play with a lot of different deck types and get good at the game in a lot of different ways, you may want to refer to your 2-triangle cheat sheet to decide which deck type you're going to start out with. The next step is to select a win condition. The card that you select as your primary win condition is going to play a huge role in determining which cards you're going to select for the rest of your deck. So this is a very important decision to make. What you'll want to do is you'll want to select a win condition that isn't easily countered by the popular cards in the meta. For example, if the cannon is very popular in the current meta, it might not be a very good decision to go with the Hog Rider. Instead, it might be a good idea to go with a miner, since the cannon doesn't do a very good job at countering the miner. You can go to deckshop.pro to take a look at the different cards to look at hard counters and soft counters to all of the cards in the game. Even though you've selected a great win condition, people are going to be familiar with how to counter that win condition. As such, it's very important to select 1 to 2 cards to help support that win condition so that you can actually deal damage to the tower. If you're playing Siege, you'll want to select a couple of cards that do a good job at helping you quickly protect your win condition from your opponent. The Log and the Fire Spirits are great examples of this. If you're playing Beatdown, you'll want to select a couple of cards that do a really good job at damaging the tower if they are protected by their tank, but they can also do a really good job at supporting the tank so that the tank does stay alive. Lightning and Electro Wizard might be a good example of this. If you're playing Control, you'll want to select a couple of cards that help your win condition deal damage to the opponent's tower. An example might be a Fireball to get rid of defensive troops, or an Ice Spirit so that your Hog Rider can land a couple extra hits on the tower. The win condition support cards that you select should also do a good job at countering the support troops and the enemy defenses that you put on your list of most commonly used cards. Now that you have an anti-meta offense, the next step is to build an anti-meta defense. For this step, you'll want to select 2 to 3 cards. The first thing you should take a look at is the most commonly used win conditions that are on your list of cards. While you don't necessarily need a very hard counter to every single win condition in the game, you'll at least want a reliable way to deal with all of the win conditions that are commonly used in the meta that you're playing. Once you have really good ways to deal with all of the meta win conditions, the next thing you want to do is take a look at the support troops that are currently being used in the meta. If you don't have a good way to deal with the win conditions and support troops that are being used on defense with the 2 to 3 cards that you selected, I recommend moving some of them around so that you can stop both of them. Now let's go ahead and do a meta check. Let's say that the Golem is actually really popular in the meta. The first thing you're thinking about is probably the Inferno Tower. The Inferno Tower does a great job at countering the Golem, so it's a great option. However, if Zap, Lightning, or the Electro Wizard are all really popular in the meta, it might not be a very good idea to go with the Inferno Tower. Instead, you could try something like Barbarians that does a really good job at handling the Golem and doesn't easily get countered by those cards. I recommend taking a look at all the cards that you selected in your deck so far and see if your anti-meta deck isn't actually countered by the meta. At this point, you should have 2 to 4 spots left over in your deck that you still need to fill. I'm going to go through a list of questions that you can ask yourself to try and figure out which exact exact cards you should put to fill those last spots, and maybe even switch around a few cards in your deck. The first thing you want to ask is, do you have a response to all of the meta win conditions? The best decks have a way to at least deal with all of the win conditions, not necessarily hard counters, but they do have a way to at least deal with them all. I recommend taking a look at deckshop.pro to take a look at all of the current win conditions. The next question you want to ask is whether or not you have a good enough offense and a good enough defense. Depending on the deck type that you want to build, you're going to have a deck that is going to be more offensive or more defensive. Regardless of the deck type though, if you don't have enough offense or defense, you're going to struggle. The next question you want to ask is whether or not your average elixir cost is where you want it to be. You may not necessarily care what your average elixir cost is, but the average elixir cost of your deck is going to influence how you're going to want to play the deck, so it's good to at least be aware of it. Would your deck benefit from having an elixir collector in there? Some decks do a really great job at having an elixir collector in there, and other decks really just do well with additional support. Synergy is a principle where two different cards do a really good job at helping each other out. For example, the Executioner with Tornado, or even Elite Barbarians with Fire Spirits. There are definitely a lot of good decks out there that don't have a lot of synergy, but most good decks at least do have some cards that work really well together. It can be very difficult for your opponent to try and face you if you have lots of cards that are cleared by similar types of cards. For example, Three Musketeers and the Elixir Collector are both targets for Fireball, but if you have both of them in there, it makes it difficult for your opponent to decide which they're going to Fireball. Another example would be Skeleton Army and Goblin Gang. I like to ask myself if I would benefit from putting a card that is similar to my other cards in there so that it makes it difficult for my opponent to counter both of them. The next question you want to ask is whether or not you have a surprise card. I highly recommend putting at least one surprise card in your deck. A surprise card is a card that isn't commonly used in the meta, and people tend to have a difficult time defending against them or dealing with the surprise that comes from that card. Having a surprise card in your deck will give you the element of surprise and encourage your opponent to make poor decisions when playing against it because they're not very used to countering it. Some examples may be Freeze, Giant Skeleton, Bomber, but that's going to depend on the meta that you're playing. You'll want to select your surprise card not because it's unpopular, but because it will also add some utility to the deck. Now, while you have a surprise card in your deck, other people are also going to have a surprise card. As such, it's important for you to have at least a way to deal with the unexpected. Versatile response cards that are relatively low in cost, like the Goblin Gang, Ice Spirit, or even the Fire Spirits, do a really good job at filling this slot. Next, you'll want to ask some questions about spells. For a lot of reasons that I'm not going to talk about in this video, you're going to want at least one spell in your deck that is a direct damage spell. For other reasons that I'm also not going to explain, you'll want to make sure that you do not have too many spells in your deck. Usually 1 to 2 spells is about right. I've seen some decks do really well with 3 spells, but typically they do have a difficult time being competitive. You'll also want to ask yourself whether or not you have the right spells in your deck. Is it better for this specific deck to have the Log or Zap? Is it better for you to have Arrows or Tornado? Is it best for you to have Rocket or Lightning? Depending on the rest of the cards in your deck as well as the meta, you'll want to make sure you select the best spell. Another question you want to ask is whether you have a way to get rid of an opponent's tower without having to build up a push. While you can have a deck that really focuses on building a strong push and just getting rid of a tower with that one push, it's a good idea to have at least one way that you can get rid of 200 to 400 damage on your opponent's tower. This could be a more expensive direct damage spell like Fireball, Lightning, or Rocket. It could also be a fast cycle to get back to your Zap, Log, or Arrows. A third thing that can do a really good job with this is an unpredictable strategy that catches your opponent off guard. Next, you'll want to ask yourself if your deck would benefit a defensive building. Defensive buildings tend to slow down the tempo of the battle, and this is going to be better for some decks and worse for other decks. You'll also want to make sure that you have counters to the cards that counter your deck. If you're playing Graveyard, you'll want to make sure that you can get rid of a lot of Swarm Troops. If you don't have counters to your deck's counters, your offenses are going to be stopped more times than not. You'll also want to make sure that you have at least a way to deal with the most common Unity decks in the game. A quick refresher for my deck building fundamentals video, Unity decks are decks that focus on having a lot of cards of a similar type so that they can try and overwhelm you with that specific utility. Common examples of these are decks that have a lot of Swarm Troops or a lot of Air Troops in them, but there are also Unity decks that focus on having a lot of Splash, a lot of tanks, a lot of heavy hitting glass cannons, as well as ground threats. If you're playing a balanced deck against a balanced deck, usually the outcome is going to come down to skill. But if you're playing a balanced deck against a Unity deck, the match is going to come down to deck building. This is why it's important for you to at least have an answer to the most common Unity decks. This answer could be the cards that you use in your deck, or it could be a specific way of playing your deck. You'll also want to take a look at your deck and ask yourself whether you made the deck that you were planning on making in the first place. At this point, you may want to switch some cards around to influence the speed or the archetype, but even if you don't, it's just important for you to be aware of how you should be playing your deck so that you can have the advantage. Even though you have a lot of really good cards in your deck right now that do a good job at countering the most popular cards. It's important for you to be aware of the deck types that will put you at an advantage simply because of the archetype and speed triangles. By applying the counter card exception that I talked about in my 2 triangle theory video, you'll be able to make some changes in here so that you can counter those decks that should have the advantage. The last thing I recommend doing is the final check. This is taking a look at deckshop.pro's deck check to make sure that you don't have any blatant weaknesses to your deck. This website shows you your offensive, defensive potential, as well as your deck's ability to counter your opponent and the deck synergies. It'll also show you if there are any major problems and some recommendations as well. It's important for you to realize that all the information on here is really good, but it's impossible for it to take into account all of the combinations that are available in the game, and as such, you should take the advice on here with a grain of salt. I've made some decks that had really great ratings that were really amazing, and also some that were just decent. The primary purpose for you checking your deck here is so that you can see if there was anything that you might not have thought about. A lot of times when I go through this process of making a really excellent deck, I will then repeat the process and look for new holes now that I have switched some cards around and added some new cards and such. It can take some time if you really put some effort into it, but it's really helpful in 2 ways. First of all, it'll help you create a really solid deck that will help counter the meta, but second, it'll help you figure out how you actually want to play your deck before you find yourself in some difficult situations. Now that you have an awesome deck, you're ready to go out and test and refine that deck. I do have a couple of suggestions for when you're doing that though. First off is to play in the right meta. One common mistake that I see people do is they take their ladder deck that they made for the ladder and then they go and practice it in classic challenges. While classic challenges are a really nice and relaxed environment to play a deck, people generally don't play their ladder decks in classic challenges. So if you want to play in the ladder, play in the ladder, but if you do want some practice before jumping right in there, then you can ask a clanmate to play against you with their ladder deck. If you are wanting to make a tournament deck, I do recommend testing it out in a classic challenge before jumping into a grand challenge, and once you've done so, then you can jump into a grand challenge once you're ready. If your deck does a good job in both classic and grand challenges, then you know that you have a solid deck that can handle a lot of unique situations in classic challenges, as well as a deck that's very competitive in grand challenges. The next suggestion that I have is to make calculated changes. You've spent a lot of time at this point making a really solid deck. Every time you lose, you're going to be tempted to switch things out. Don't switch it out until you've played a few matches. In my experience, playing at least 5 to 10 matches is usually an okay time to determine whether or not your deck is going to do well in the meta. As you make those changes, I recommend taking a look at your replays of your losses. You'll want to ask yourself if you could have fixed the situation by playing differently. You'll also want to ask yourself if you just simply had a bad card rotation. And finally, you'll want to see if switching out your card for a different one would have been beneficial. Then you'll want to try and make changes to your deck that will add to your deck without taking too much away. Let's go ahead and do a quick refresher so you can take a good screenshot. Before actually getting into building a deck, you'll want to select the right deck type. Then you'll want to start with your win condition. Select 2 to 3 cards that will support your win condition, 2 to 3 cards as an anti-meta defense, and then check to make sure that your cards actually aren't also countered by the meta. And finally, fill those holes. Once you've gone through that list, go ahead and test and refine that deck with the principles that I talked about. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. If you liked what you saw, go ahead and like and subscribe. Make sure you leave a comment below and let me know if it was helpful or if you do have any questions. I read all of my comments, so I promise you won't be missed. If the video was helpful for you, make sure you share it with your fellow Clashers so that they can get something out of it as well. And guys, always Clash on. For now, this is Karostime ticking by, and we will see you in the arena.